Everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Rutgers Geology Museum's Ask a Geologist web series. So today we have a very special guest. We have Monica Norton, who will be speaking for us today. Monica actually went to Rutgers University and she graduated from there with a master's, and she will tell you more about all of that. She's a staff geologist at Roux Associates Inc. And today she's talking to us about environmental pollution of our water and air. So without further ado, Monica, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Ria. So just to jump right in very quickly to give a little information about myself. As Ria said, my name is Monica. I live in Highland Park with my fiance and 2 cats. Some personal things about me: I love to play soccer. I'll actually be coaching recreational soccer in Highland Park starting next week. And I like going for hikes. So when I was a student at Rutgers, I studied hydrogeology, which is the study of groundwater. And groundwater is exactly what it sounds like. For those who might not know, it's water that exists underground. So when rain falls onto the ground, some of it will seep down into the soil and is stored underground. You all have likely seen it if you've been to the beach before. If you've been making a sandcastle or something and digging in the sand, you might have noticed the sand gets a little wetter as you go deeper, and you might actually see water seep into your hole, and that's essentially groundwater. So currently, I work as a geologist at an environmental consulting firm in Somerset, which is close to Rutgers in New Brunswick, called Roux. And I'll talk more about that later during my presentation, and about what environmental consulting is. And then last, just a fun fact, just a fact about myself, my favorite mineral is watermelon tourmaline, and it looks like that. And watermelon tourmaline is a bicolor mineral, meaning it can have more than one color. And in this case, the colors look a lot like a watermelon. And actually, sometimes the colors are reversed, where the pink is on the outside and the green is on the inside, and that's called anti-watermelon tourmaline. Okay, so to begin, let's just first talk about what even is pollution. So pollution is the introduction of harmful materials into the environment. These harmful materials are called pollutants, and they can be natural, like volcanic ash, which impacts air quality. Also could be natural, like wildfires, which, like the ones currently occurring in California and Australia and Siberia. That's also like a natural pollutant that can impact air quality, for example. But they can also be man-made, which means they're created by human activity, like trash or chemicals produced by factories. And ultimately, pollutants damage the quality of our air. Oops, I didn't put the definition there, sorry. They can damage the quality of our air, of our water, and of our soil. And there are other kind of pollutants like noise and light, and I'm not really going to be focusing much on that today. I'm mainly going to be focusing on air, water, and soil. All right, so before I talk more about pollutants, let's first talk about the water cycle to understand how the air, water, and land are all connected. So you all here should be pretty familiar with rain, and maybe you even know the fancy word for rain, which is called precipitation. So if you were a drop of rain falling onto the land, your number one goal is to make it to the lowest place that you can find, which is the ocean. So when you fall onto the land as a raindrop, you might flow down the surface of the land until you reach a water body, which will then carry you to the ocean. And that's actually called runoff. But also, you might actually infiltrate into the land and become a part of the groundwater. So, how I mentioned before what groundwater was. So basically, underneath the ground, there are little particles of soil, and in between that soil, there's air. So when the water moves through those particles of soil, it eventually will reach an area where it's completely filled with water, and that is an aquifer where our stored underground water exists. So both cases, whether you're moving by runoff or by groundwater flow, eventually you'll reach the ocean. And when you reach the ocean, you'll evaporate back into the air where you become a gas again and condense back into a cloud where the whole cycle will begin again. That's why it's called a cycle. So let's look back at this landscape to determine what sort of human-related activities can contribute to pollution. All right, so let's start by building a factory. Factories release large smokestacks, which contain a lot of greenhouse gases and pollutants that impact air quality negatively. What else? Factories also dump dirty water, used chemicals, toxic waste, and sometimes they can spill oil into the land or water, kind of like you see right over here. And these chemicals can then poison our groundwater. All right, what else is a human activity? Okay, we can have farms, right? So farms often use manure, fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides in order to get large crop yields. And these products actually can impact soil and air quality negatively. They contain a lot of toxic chemicals in them. Also, poop from animals, there's a cow, poop from the animal, while it's natural, it is also a pollutant and in large quantities can negatively impact the environment. Speaking of poop, imagine, that the sewer lines can get damaged and they can leak and or flood, and that can actually then spread pollutants into our groundwater systems. All right. So gas stations hold a lot of gasoline in tanks underground, which can, leak this these petroleum products. And you can see this guy over here is being very, very careless with this gasoline, just pouring it right all over the ground. So one more thing I'll point out is that humans produce a lot of trash, and a lot of that trash ends up in rivers, streams, oceans, and it can't be broken down naturally. So this is just an example of some different human activities that can exist on Earth that can contribute to pollution. And you might think that if you were to spill some oil or drop some trash or spray some harmful chemicals in one location, that you might not be impacting anyone outside of that location. But you have to remember that there's a water cycle, there's wind, there's weather, right? And when water rains down onto the surface, it'll pick up all those pollutants and carry them into our rivers and into our groundwater and into our drinking supplies and into the ocean. And so while the water cycle is a cycle, pollution is not a cycle. It accumulates and it grows over time. And this unfortunately results in a very sad Earth. All right, so now you might be curious whether you live somewhere that is polluted. Well, actually, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, which is a state agency whose mission is to protect the environment and human health, has compiled a statewide database that contains all known contaminated sites in New Jersey. And anyone, anyone can access this website, type in an address to see if there are any contaminated sites near you. So just to show you an example, I took a few screenshots from the website of different locations. So first, let's look at New Brunswick, which is where Rutgers University, one of the campuses of Rutgers University, is located. So when you look at this database and you check this layer called known contaminated sites, little stars will appear wherever there's a site that's known to be contaminated. And you can probably see that you notice that there are more red stars right at the center of the city of where New Brunswick is. And that's because there are a lot of people there. And it's also important to note that cities are built usually near water. And Rutgers is right on the Raritan River, which eventually runs into the ocean. And surface and groundwater that flows into the Raritan River can pick up a lot of contamination from cities and bring them into the ocean. All right, let's go somewhere with less people just to compare how much contamination we might see. So I don't know if anyone's ever been to the Delaware Water Gap, but it's in northwestern New Jersey and it's a national park. So I typed in Delaware Water Gap into GeoWeb, and I could really not find many stars. And it makes sense because preserved land and people can't live there. And often there's a lot of known contamination where people are living. So in this particular location, I only saw one little star as I was moving around in this area. So you can see there's a huge difference depending on where people are. And one more example, let's now go somewhere. Let's go to a very dense city where there are a lot of people and factories and industries, like Newark, New Jersey. So Newark, New Jersey, as I just said, it's a very dense city, and there are a lot of industries there. And so there are a lot of stars, and it's right there next to a water body. So go ahead after this if you want and look up where you live. All right, so why should we care, right? So first of all, we only have one Earth, right? And Earth is indescribably unique, and it's our home. We're adapted to survive on this planet, and we have no backup planet waiting for us that we can live as comfortably on as we do on Earth. So we have to be mindful of how we treat our planet, especially if we want our children and our grandchildren and so on to get the chance to live here too. Let's see, why else? Oops. Oh, okay, sorry, too many. All right, so another thing is that when people and animals and plants are exposed to polluted air, water, or soil, there are a lot of negative health impacts. So it's in your best interest to care so that you stay healthy. Air pollution impacts our respiratory systems, and we need healthy respiratory systems to combat respiratory illnesses like coronavirus, which are becoming more commonplace. And the last reason is I'm sure you've likely heard about, and that's climate change. Climate change is directly linked to pollution, specifically man-made pollutants such as greenhouse gases that are emitted into the air from burning fossil fuels. Climate change is happening now, and our Earth's equilibrium is shifting, temperatures are rising, sea levels rising. There are so many other consequences of climate change that are happening today and will continue to happen in the future. And as young individuals, it's in your best interest to care about these issues because while it might have been your parents or their parents who have contributed to climate change so far, you will be the one who has to adapt to our changing planet in the future. All right, so what can we as a human population do about it to prevent pollution, right? So at the governmental level, laws can be passed that will protect the environment and human health. The EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, is an executive agency of the US government that was established in 1970, and it manages environmental protection matters. Businesses also need to be held accountable for their actions. A business as usual attitude is no longer acceptable. They need to implement sustainable practices and find ways to be successful without sacrificing the health of our environment. There are a lot of environmental groups like the Sierra Club, which seek to protect and monitor the environment. They spread awareness, they hold people and organizations accountable for their actions, and they push for change in policies that are environmentally conscious. We also have scientists and researchers who work on understanding the impacts of contamination, and they also use technology and their knowledge to come up with ways to clean up the environment and repair the environment. There are so many man-made chemicals that are produced every day, and this list continues to grow, and we're still learning so much about them. There are emerging contaminants that appear all the time that we're still learning about their impact. So it's a very important role that scientists and researchers have too. There are also educators who play a good role, which is to effectively communicate and spread the word, and like we're doing right now, and you also have the opportunity to do. And then at the individual level, there are many things that you can do to play a part, and I will discuss more specifically in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to focus on scientists, researchers, because as a geologist, this is where I come into play, and this is what I do. So, as I mentioned, I work for an environmental consulting firm, and it's called Roux, which you can see here. So environmental consultants consist of geologists like myself, or environmental scientists, or engineers, and we use our expertise and our knowledge in our field to advise businesses and governmental agencies on the best practices for cleaning up contaminated sites and preventing future contamination. So we try to solve some of the most challenging and complex environmental problems and find sustainable solutions. And Me in particular, my job consists of a mixture of hands-on field work and office work. And before we can come up with a solution to remediating or cleaning up a site, we first need to assess the state of contamination. And we can often achieve this by sampling the soil, the air, and the water at a site, sending those results to a laboratory to be analyzed, and then figuring it out from there. So let's talk about soil sampling a little bit. So we can collect soil samples many different ways. One way is you can use a hand auger, which you can see that's this instrument, this piece of equipment that I'm using here, where you twist it and push it into the ground, and you're able to pull soil up. But hand augers can only retrieve soil at shallow depths, like this is maybe 5 feet. So if you need to collect soil much deeper, even 20, 30, 40, 50 feet deeper, you can install soil borings. And a soil boring is essentially like a giant straw that you stick into the ground. And when you pull that big straw up, you get a lot of soil. And that is kind of what it looks like over here, like a big straw you stick into the ground. And when you pull it up, it'll look something like this. And in order to push that straw into the ground, you need a lot of force. So we'll often use a drill rig, or we'll hire someone to operate this drill rig and push down to the depth that we want them to in order to retrieve this boring log. And in the boring, there's a lot of soil, and proper identification is very important of the soil at this stage. And that's where being a geologist really comes into play. So there are many different types of soil, like sand, silt, clay, cobbles, and then there are just rocks as well that you need to think about too. And contamination will behave differently in each different type of texture. So for example, you could imagine that contamination would travel really quickly through a layer of sand since it's very loose and there's a lot of space between the particles. But once you reach a clay where there's less space between the particles, the contamination might stop. And this is important so we can predict the behavior of contamination. So if you imagine that this tannish layer is sand and contamination and some oil was spilled, right? It might travel down into the sand and stop once it reaches this dark layer. Maybe it's a clay. And so by characterizing and understanding soil, you can really predict where contamination might be going or where it is, and find a solution to clean it up. And in one of the ways in the fields, when we look at the soil, that we can identify if it might be contaminated, other than collecting a sample and sending it to a lab to be analyzed, is you can use this instrument, and its fancy word is called a photoionization detector. And it's basically like a sniffer that can sniff out if there's contamination, and you hold it up to the soil and you can scan it and figure out where the contamination is. All right, so there's also groundwater sampling, and we collect groundwater samples from a well, which also is like a big straw or like a tube that goes into the ground. And the photo on the right here shows another drill rig that is actually installing a well into the ground. And that's that big. It really does look like a giant straw. And they're going to drop that right into the ground. And once it's in the ground, the water will flow up into the tube. And then we can pump water from the well into our sample. So you can kind of imagine just how important understanding water contamination is. Imagine that this is a well right here, and people pump from this well as their groundwater that they drink from, like a drinking well. And someone spilled some sort of a chemical up here. You'll get this, it's called a plume, which is an area of groundwater that's contaminated. And that groundwater, while you spilt something over here or someone spilt something over here, it can actually affect this person's drinking water down here, because the water can move underground. And once again, when you understand the layers of soil and the geology that the water is moving through, you can predict where the water might be going and who might be receiving that contamination. And we can confirm that by taking a sample from this well to see if it's contaminated. All right, and sometimes when there's contaminated soil or groundwater, vapors can fill the pore spaces. Remember how there was air in between the soil particles? And the vapors can fill those spaces and migrate and travel upward toward the surface of the earth, like this figure shows here. And the soil gases can actually migrate through cracks in your basement, crawl spaces, and the foundation of your home, and actually seep into your living space. I know a lot of times in New Jersey, radon, which is a natural gas, it naturally occurs, right? Can often seep out of the bedrock and into people's homes. And so they have these mitigation systems to pump that air, that radon from underground out of their house so it won't be into their homes. And similarly, when you have contaminated soil or groundwater, like for example, if you had a gasoline spill, those vapors actually are volatile. They're called volatile organic carbons, or VOCs for short, and they can migrate upwards and get into the cracks of your house. So what we do is we can sample both the ambient air that you're breathing in your basement, for example, or the first floor of your house, to see if any of those contaminants are in the air. And we can also, as a more preventative thing, sample the soil air, the air in between the pore spaces of the soil underneath your house, to figure out if there are contaminants that could seep and migrate into your house. So the way that we would do this is we drill a hole through the floor of your house, right through the floor until it gets into the soil. And then you just stick a tube down into the soil and pump the air out, and that's how you would collect that sample. All right, so I talked a lot about what I do to prevent pollution and to clean up pollution and all the different ways that other people can prevent pollution. But I just want to, before I end, talk a little bit about what you can do. So first of all, you have the power to educate your friends, your family, parents, your teachers, anyone about preventing pollution and about what's happening. And then there are little things that you can do every day. I think I just heard this morning that there's some new law in New Jersey that is really not permitting plastic bags and plastic packaging to be used as much in New Jersey, which is really great. And it's great to show your support for those sort of policies that are getting approved. And you yourself, you can try to use less disposable items rather than using plastic straws. You can get like a reusable straw, or you can bring your bags with you when you go to the store. You can even pick up items and recycle them if you see them on the ground. I'm sure your parents remind you to turn off your lights and your electronics. You can always remember to do that. Maybe don't run your water too long when you're brushing your teeth. Use refillable water bottles. Figure out, can you buy less? Are there things you can buy that are reused? Maybe you can tell your friends or your family to encourage them to buy food and clothes that are made without pesticides. There are a whole list of things, and if you're interested, you can always reach out, because there are definitely, even though it feels small, it makes an impact that you can do in your everyday life. So thank you for your time. Let me know if you have any questions. Oh, and that will lead to a happy Earth. So yes, now I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, Monica, so you can go ahead and answer the questions.
All right. Okay, let's see. All right, well, in the chat, I see one from my dad, actually. How much time do we have to stop climate change? That's a very good question, and I think it's really debated. And stop climate change, it's kind of maybe difficult to just stop it, but because even right now, if we were to stop all of our emissions of greenhouse gases and stop burning fossil fuels, there's a lag, there's like a delay in the impact on the earth, and temperatures would still rise even if we stopped everything today. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try, because obviously if we continue as business as usual, temperatures will rise a lot more than we're really prepared to handle. So I know there's actually, I was talking with Ria about this yesterday. There's a clock in Times Square that's called like the climate change clock or something. And if you know more about it, feel free to let me know. But this clock is putting 7 years until the amount of, it gives us basically 7 years until the amount of impact that we're going to be causing will be too much for us to handle. So, and that essentially is being calculated by, we have 7 years to do something until it's really too late to reverse or, repair the environment for us to live comfortably. So it's a good question. And I think that rather than asking how much time we have, we should just start now trying. Okay, let's see what else there is. Okay, let me look. All right, so is pollution generated more from humans or from natural causes? So that's a good question. If I were to guess, I would say from humans. And in fact, it's kind of related. So you've been hearing probably about these wildfires that have been happening all different parts of the world. And while wildfires are a natural phenomenon that take place, climate change and, which is, caused by emitting fossil fuels can actually exasperate the impacts of wildfires. And so the two can be pretty related. Have there ever been any oil spills in New Jersey? That's a good question. I'm not sure if there are any like big or notable ones, but small oil spills for sure. Most gas stations I've seen have had some sort of an oil spill. But one of those huge oil spills like the BP oil spill, I haven't heard about that, but I don't know. Okay, let's see. How did the drinking water in Newark, New Jersey get contaminated with lead? I'm pretty sure that was actually partially from rusting pipes, which are made with lead, can go into the groundwater when they're old and not repaired. And I remember one time I was sampling water in a school in Newark, and we opened up the faucet, and the water that came out was yellow, which was really gross. Okay. All right. Ria's mom would like to know. Thank you, Ria's mom, for listening today. Recently, many beaches on Long Beach Island, LBI, have been closed because of bacteria in the water. For example, Surf City has had a lot of bacteria, and I want to know, where did that come from? Does it have anything to do with older, rusty pipes? That's a very good question. And I can't tell you with certainty where exactly the bacteria comes from. But just from, this presentation, you can see that everything drains to the ocean, and there are so many ways that all these nutrients and all these other, fertilizers and oil and all these things that get washed off the land and into the ocean can really negatively impact the ocean. But specifically, the bacteria, I don't know exactly where that comes from. I'm interested to find out, though. All right, let's see. Okay. Okay, so how is pollution linked to the loss of species here in New Jersey from Mary and Scotch Plains? So you might have noticed plastic. You probably have seen like pictures of fish and marine life getting stuck in plastic and ingesting and eating a lot of plastic. And for example, a New Jersey specific example is that ospreys actually collect a lot of trash and use them as nesting material, and it can sometimes entangle them and trap them and kill them. Let's see what else. What is the most difficult pollution to undo in the environment? All right, so I think that some very difficult pollutants to undo are carbon dioxide, right? So when you emit it from burning fossil fuels, well, actually, even other sort of emissions can just stay for a long time in the atmosphere. And so even if you've emitted it 50 years ago, you're still dealing with the impacts years and years after that. Oh, and there's a new emerging contaminant that's come out that we've been finding everywhere and have very harmful effects, and it's called PFAS, which is perfluoro. I'm sorry, you can't quote me on that, but there are all these different kind of perfluoro type of chemicals that are found often in Teflon or sunscreen. They're found in all different sort of everyday products that we use, and it's a new emerging contaminant where actually I'm going to a site on Monday to sample for it, and we don't even have set rules and regulations yet because it's such a new contaminant that we're still understanding and developing standards for. All right, let's see what else there is. So how can groundwater contamination be cleaned up? All right, well, there are many ways actually that groundwater contamination can be cleaned up. And one way that people do is called like natural monitoring. And to summarize, it's kind of the solution to pollution is dilution. And then over time, if you have some contamination in an area and you block it out underground, like that plume I was talking about, you sort of delineate the extent of it. Over time, when it gets diluted with more water, it can naturally mitigate itself. But there are technologies that can be used to clean up groundwater. So, for example, there's a site in Newark, New Jersey, where there are a lot of petroleum related contaminants. And the way that we are cleaning them up is rather than pumping that water out or just letting it dilute over time because the concentrations are too high for that. What we do is we inject different nutrients like bugs that will basically eat up that oil and stuff and naturally remove the contamination. So that's what we've been doing in injection. We mix different nutrients with water and we pump it into the ground, and then we monitor it to make sure that the water is getting cleaner. All right, what else is there? Okay. Ariel and Amy want to know, what is the most common type of contamination that you see in your work? That's a good question. And I would say personally, I don't know, I don't have the most experience, but from my experience, I definitely see a lot of those volatile organic compounds, which are in cleaning solvents, they're in degreasing processes that a lot of industries use, and also a lot of petroleum related contamination is what I see. Okay, Michelle asks, what is the tipping point and what technology is being developed to absorb carbon dioxide? Well, thank you, Mom, for that question. So the tipping point, I don't know offhand what exactly it is. I assume you're asking for carbon dioxide. What's the amount of concentration that we can have in the air for reversing it to be impossible or for adapting to that to be impossible? I don't know exactly what the estimates are off the top of my head, but I think right now we're at like 400 parts per million of CO2. And we're already estimated to probably go up at least a degree or so by mid-century. And I think if we keep business as usual, it certainly will warm the earth at levels that we won't be prepared for. But the tipping point, that's a good question. I don't know exactly where it is. And I'm sure that it's also heavily debated exactly where it is because it's not a clean-cut number. There are so many small processes that are involved, and it's not just causation. In fact, it's like a domino effect where one thing will affect another thing, and it's a very, very difficult subject to predict. All we know is it's definitely happening. All right. Ria's mom would like to know, I saw last year or the year before in the summertime that there were a lot of dead fish washing up on the Jersey shore. What caused all these fish to die? Uh, so once again, this specific incident, I'm not sure, but if I were to predict, I would think that, you know, as I was describing with the last question that I think you asked, when you have all of these nutrients that are being added into the water, while nutrients seem like a good thing, right? Because the algae in the water will want to eat it up, um, it actually throws everything off balance. So when you have one organism that can outcompete everything else and all these nutrients that are added by that runoff, right, going into the water, it will actually result in overpopulation maybe of algae. And then when there's too much algae, there'll be too much competition, and then there could be a lot of death, and then you can get a lot of microorganisms eating up that algae, and that can result in a change in the oxygen levels in the ocean's water, and it can really mess up the equilibrium of the ocean's water and result in a lot of fish deaths. So I don't know if that answers the specific question. Pat Donahue says, yes, there were very large oil spills in the Arthur Kill many, many years ago. Okay, thank you, Pat, for letting me know. All right. What is the most exciting place that your research has taken you? I got to go through Rutgers with my professor, Gail Ashley. She's a geology professor, recently retired actually at Rutgers. And I went with her to Tanzania, Africa, to study groundwater there. And we studied a lot of springs there, and it's a very dry area, but they have these beautiful springs that provide water year round. And they really hadn't been studied. So we went there to study that, and it was really amazing experience. All right, let's see, what else am I missing? Ria's mom would also like to know, when you go out to do your field work, what types of wildlife do you encounter? Okay, so that's a good question. She asked specifically, do you ever see snakes in New Jersey? And I think I've seen like a garden snake maybe once, but I see surprisingly a lot of street cats in the areas that I'm working, and they're really tough looking street cats. But unfortunately, I see a lot of bees. Sometimes when you open up a well, there are bees inside, and really nothing amazing in terms of wildlife that I get to see. Because a lot of times I'm working in cities, sometimes I'll go out into a more less populated area, but a lot of times I'm working in cities, so I don't get to see the best stuff. All right. A lot of questions. Really good questions. Some of them I can't really answer. Okay. Ariel would like to know, do scientists agree on climate change? Do any say it's not real? So I think most scientists are in consensus that climate change is a real thing and it's happening, but there are definitely people and scientists who provide information to show the opposite. But there is most consensus. I think there is mostly a consensus that it's happening. Okay. Ariel also wants to know, what's your favorite thing about being a geologist? That's a good question, Ariel. So my favorite thing about being a geologist is, it takes me to really awesome places and in the field where you get to see, you get to travel and you get to see new and different kinds of environments. And also, what I really like is that you can be very curious. And if you have a question, geology is all about finding the answer. So you can continue to be geologist and say, well, why is that there? And why is this happening that way? And then you get to come up with a solution to figure out the answer. And it's very hands-on like that. And I think that's what I like most about geology is it satisfies my curiosity. All right. What test or instrument would you like to invent for your work? That's a fun question. I think who asked that? Mary again from Scotch Plains. So I think if I could come up with an instrument, I have no idea how this would happen, but I don't know if you all are aware with Shazam, which is like something an app that you can use to identify a song if you don't know the song. And I know they have made like the same thing for plants, where you can take a picture of a plant and it'll identify what plant it is for you. But it would be great if they had Shazam for contamination, which is like expediting the whole lab process. It would be great if you could just take a picture and maybe it could identify exactly what soil you're looking at. That would be kind of cool. And tell you if it's contaminated, what kind of contamination, but that's kind of fantasy. All right. Can I test for air and water pollution at home and how? I know that if you have your own well, your own well water, and if you're don't have public well water, or you can probably just grab a sample. You can buy a kit to collect a sample. I know that sometimes the town will send water reports, but I'm pretty sure that there are companies that you can hire to test the water and the air for you. And while the firm that I work for is usually for corporations and at a larger scale, we definitely do it. And but there are definitely ways that there are kits probably you could buy for testing your own water, for example. So I'm not as familiar with what it is. Can I remove microplastics from my water? That's a really good question. And I don't know because they're supposed to be so small you can't see them, from my understanding. So I don't know how you would filter that. So that's a really good question and something that is definitely a concern. So nice question, Mary. So what should I ask my town or government to prevent or clean up pollution? So as I spoke about earlier in the presentation, that there's this new initiative in New Jersey and a new policy to move away from using plastics. That's definitely an example of something that you can ask your town or government to do, which is, if you live in a school, maybe you can figure out how much those water fountains are that you don't have to press a button, it'll just refill your water bottle for you, because those save water as well. And if you can advocate for installing those in your school, that would be a cool idea. What else? Do you work in urban areas or more undeveloped places? I work in a mixture of both. Sometimes we'll work in an area that hasn't been developed, but they want to develop it, but first they want to check if there's any sort of an environmental concern. But mostly my experience is in more urban areas because, as you saw from that GeoWeb slide, there's just a lot of contamination there. All right. What else? What is the, oh wait, oops. All right, just looking through the questions, the ones that I've answered.
Sorry, Monica.
No, it's okay.
There's one more question for you. Do any other fields help you in your work at Roux?
Any other fields help me in my work at Roux? Like if you mean different sort of subjects of study that might help me in my work. So geology definitely helped a lot. So other sort of, let me think, other sort of fields that are helpful were if you did any sort of engineering, because a lot of the systems that are created are engineered systems to remediate, to clean up contamination. Let's see, what else? So if you took chemistry, that actually is really helpful because there are so many chemicals that we have to learn about, and they're a mouthful to pronounce. So it's helpful to understand, even though we aren't a laboratory and we're not conducting the analyses, we get all the results back and we have to interpret them correctly. And so chemistry is definitely something that can help your understanding at Roux. What else? Really, a lot of what you learn, what I've learned at Roux, I learned at Roux. But having that geology background definitely really helped me understand things a lot better and ask the right questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Monica. I think you answered all of the questions. That was a lot of questions, so good job.
Thank you.
Thanks again for doing this for us. And for everyone who is watching, thank you so much for joining us today. And so our next Ask a Geologist will be on Friday, October 9th at 1 p.m. And Dr. Sarah Sheffield will be speaking to us. She is an assistant professor at the University of South Florida. And she'll be speaking about echinoderm paleontology. So that's going to be on October 9th. So our series will be hosted bi-weekly. So once again, thank you so much, Monica. It was great seeing you, and I learned a lot. And I hope you have a really good weekend.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.